Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I'm so happy that you are joining us today. As we support one another's practice, one another's efforts. And that will be the focus of the discussion today is right effort. Sama Vayamo. Which is part of the Eightfold Path we've been discussing. And it's the third division in the third division of the Eightfold Path, the part that is often referred to as mental development. There's right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration, those three. So what is right effort? The Buddha has a definition for right effort, and I'll try to display that. In one of the suttas, he says, in so many words, right effort involves abandoning those things which are unwholesome, unskillful, ineffective, refraining from adopting new patterns of body, speech, and mind that are unwholesome, unskillful, ineffective, cultivating those things which are wholesome, skillful, and effective, and maintaining those patterns that you presently have of body, speech, and mind that are wholesome, skillful, and effective. Effective in what? Effective in leading to long-term happiness, long-term well-being for oneself and others. Because with only a modest amount of reflection, you can discern that long-term well-being, long-term happiness for oneself depends on the same for others. So that's the Buddha's definition, at least in one sutta. He oftentimes will define things differently at different times with different audiences, but that seems fairly straightforward and logical. I mean, why wouldn't you want to abandon things that are unskillful, ineffective, that lead to distress, despair, suffering for oneself and others? And why wouldn't you want to adopt patterns that, to the contrary? Well, the difficulties, of course, are in the details. I think anyone with a moderate degree of self-reflection can put together a list of things that get in the way. Most often along the lines of short-term gains. It might feel really good to tell somebody off when you have a grievance against them or to cause them harm. It might feel good in the short term. But in the long term, it perpetuates, of course, suffering for others as well as oneself. So it's unskillful, unwholesome, ineffective. So, meditation is a form of self-reflection, giving yourself time to investigate patterns, notice patterns of thought which precede patterns of speech and action, and come to a better understanding of them. And it's a subtle thing because having a strong aversive reaction to some pattern of yours doesn't always make it go away. It can just make it go into hiding. So there's subtlety in all of this. And in general, during meditation, an attitude of openness and friendliness seems to work best. The Buddha had another comment about right effort in another sutta, and he was talking at this time to Sona, one of his monks. And Sona had been a musician before joining or becoming a monastic, and he had played the veena, which is an ancient instrument in India going back thousands of years, long before the Buddha. And Sona was distressed because he was, practice, practice, practice. He was sitting, he was just, really working hard, and he just didn't feel like he was getting anywhere. He didn't feel like he was attaining the goal. So the Buddha said to Sona, well, remember when you were a musician, a veena player? If you turn the peg and tighten the string too much, did you get a pleasing sound? And Sona said, no, that doesn't work. And the Buddha said, well, if you don't tighten it enough, do you get a pleasing sound? It said, no, it rattles against the frets. It's not pleasing. So the Buddha used this as an illustration of how the middle path can be applied to right effort. That right effort is not necessarily more effort. In our culture, we tend to equate the two. If what you're doing isn't working, you just do it harder and harder and harder. But actually, while we're on the topic of string instruments, one of the most common difficulties that students have in learning to play, for instance, the violin or the cello, is pressing too hard, pressing the string into the fingerboard with too much force. And that tends to dampen the function of the string, which is to vibrate, and it also changes the pitch slightly in a way that's not pleasing. So the instruction is to press the string down with as little effort as you can to achieve the desired effect. And actually, another consequence of pressing too hard is injury. It's the most common cause of tendon injury in string players. So I don't know about you, but during during COVID, I find myself developing unusual interests, and I got interested in, well, what is this vina that Sona was playing, and is it like a sitar? And it is kind of like a sitar. It's but the fingerboard is different. It instead of having these movable arching frets, it has frets that are fixed in place and go straight across. And I bring this up in part because I guess a good illustration of right effort is a video that I happened upon of this old man making a, probably not older than I am, making a, constructing the fingerboard for a vina, which actually is made out of wax. There are two wax bands that go along the side. And it's just beautiful, but it illustrates his focus, giving the right amount of attention. It illustrates right effort. Anyway, I'll send along a link to that video. It's about 20 minutes. So if you have any interest at all, you might enjoy it. It's beautifully done. So effort would seem to imply some sort of goal. If you're trying to make effort, you're trying to accomplish something. And really all religious traditions, at least the traditional ones, would seem to have a goal of cultivating wisdom and compassion. But wisdom and compassion are you can't just will them. You can't just will yourself to be wise or even will yourself to be compassionate. Where do they come from? So I see practice as not so much working real hard to be wise and compassionate, but to simply create the conditions for nurturing those qualities which are already somehow here, which are already somehow in us. When we were talking about the Bendawa, Dogen, who wrote that work, used the term Jijuyu Zanmai to describe Zazen. And the Japanese Jijuyu Zanmai, as I understand it from people who are familiar with the language, can be roughly translated as Ji, self, Ju, receiving, you, use or using, and Zanmai, samadhi, mental absorption, or absorption of the body and mind. So it's the self, receiving, and using. Receiving what? From where? Well, here we get into, I think, something mysterious. Having created the conditions in our meditation practice for being receptive, according to Dogen, is a way of actualizing Buddha nature, what he referred to as Buddha nature. For Dogen, you don't have Buddha nature, you actually are Buddha nature. And not only you, but everything is Buddha nature. But it can only manifest under the proper conditions. It requires cultivation, nourishment. It requires use. So there's the receiving and the using. The self receiving and using the self, as one teacher described it. Receiving from where? So where do these things come from? Where does wisdom come from? Where does compassion come from? I think there are many different ways of conceptualizing this, imagining this. In the West, we might think, well, it's sort of built into our genes. We get it from our parents. It's biological. Or we might think it comes from the Buddhas and ancestors. It's a gift to us. But I think no matter how one conceptualizes it, it's still a matter of receiving it, welcoming, being open. So the effort is not only active, but it's passive, receiving and using. We might conceptualize it as taking refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, as relying on those, as receiving their wisdom and their compassion. So right effort, it's complicated, and I think worthy of investigation. And I don't pretend to exhaust the topic here, but just to stimulate some interest and stimulate some contemplation of right effort. In the Bendoa that I mentioned earlier, there is a passage that we've referred to before that I think is germane here when we're thinking about effort. To carry yourself forward and experience myriad things is delusion. that myriad things come forth and experience themselves is awakening. So I think one thing I forgot to mention, which I'll conclude with, is a story about Shinru Suzuki, the well-known contemporary, or now past, but teacher at the San Francisco Zen Center, who inspired so many people in the West. But the San Francisco Zen Center is, and was at the time a very active place, and people would come and go and get a taste of it and show up and want to know more about what was going on. And a young man came to one of their services, and during the discussion afterwards, he asked Suzuki Roshi, "How long does it take to get enlightened?" And Suzuki, perhaps with tongue in cheek, said, 5 years. 5 years if you come to services regularly and meditate twice a day. So the young man, being young and being impatient and being ambitious, said, "Well, what about if I meditate 6 times a day? How long will it take then?" And Suzuki said, 10 years. So right effort is not necessarily more effort, but right effort, appropriate effort, skillful effort, effort with awareness. So thank you very much for listening to those thoughts, and I'll stop now and see if anyone has any comments about effort or otherwise, and especially if there are people who are new to the group who want to let us know a little bit about yourself. We would love that, and would like to hear from you. And any questions or concerns you have don't need to be confined to today's topic. Thank you.